Thank you, Philippa, and thank you to all of you. What a delight it is to be here in my beloved Legatum Institute. I've been involved in the Institute here for many years now, almost back to the institution of this Institute. And I think more than about 12 years now, as a matter of fact, I've been haunting this beautiful place. And what a joy and an honor it is for me to be part of the board, to look at the progress, to look at how this institute has bloomed morally and playing a bigger and bigger role in the life of this city and in point of fact, what we're looking at across the Atlantic and the United States as well. Thank you to all of you for coming out to talk a little bit about this book which has been occupying the last 13 weeks of my life since it was published in the United States and now here in the UK from my friends at Bloomsbury Publishing. I hope you enjoy it if you decide to read it. And in any case, I hope the ideas in this will be helpful to you personally and as you pursue your own journey of happiness, of fulfillment, of lifting other people up and bringing them together. The name is relatively self-explanatory, but the genesis of the book isn't. This is a very personal book for me about the journey I've been trying to take in my own life to understand how I can actually be a happier person. Now, it's important that I be a happy person. Let me tell you why. I'm a professor of happiness. I literally teach happiness at Harvard University, and it's a bad look if I'm not happy. Now, but let me fill you in on one thing about I know practically every social scientist who specializes in the science of happiness, and there's a reason that they're studying that. They're in search of it. They're seekers. It's not research, it's me-search when it comes to happiness. And so this is one of the things that we're trying to do in this particular field. But this project in particular is especially personal. And let me tell you why. This project started in this area of research for me, which is my old laboratory, the airplane. Now, as a social scientist specializing in happiness, as a behavioralist, my laboratory is the overheard conversation at the Starbucks, on the airplane. If you're behind me in a line and you're saying something especially intimate about your heart and I hear it, I might write a book about it. This is where the really interesting things happen for people in my field. Now, I've been involved in this as a trained social scientist for many, many years. But some years ago, I was trying to apply the ideas to my life in a brand new way because I got to tell you, I was a little bit insecure about the workings of my life. Now, to give you a little bit of background, before I came to Harvard University, before I was working in the laboratory as a social scientist and teaching this material, until 2019, I had Philippa's job. Not here, but at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., which is one of the oldest think tanks in the world, a classically liberal think tank, very much morally aligned with the Legatum Institute. Since then, I've moved entirely my heart to the Legatum Institute, but for 11 years, I was the chief executive of the American Enterprise Institute. Now, it was a great job. I won't lie to you. It was wonderful, but my job primarily was doing two things. I was giving 175 speeches a year about the importance of free enterprise for lifting people out of poverty and good public policy and better politics and love for people at all parts of our society. 175 talks a year, and I had to raise $50 million a year to keep our doors open. Every year. So my job was like running for the Senate and never getting elected. And I have to tell you, it was fun, it was exciting, it was tiring. And I was starting to think about 7 or 8 years ago, what's the end game? Now, some of you are probably thinking about this in the context of your own lives. What am I trying to do here? What's the cadence of this work? What is the beginning, middle, and end? Or is it just to run and then run some more until finally somebody takes it away? I didn't know the answer to that, and I wanted the answer to that. Well, I got a beginning of the answer to that on the plane. It was 8 years ago, and I was doing what I always did, which was flying around. And I was coming back on an evening flight from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. Now, some of you know, maybe some of you have taken that flight. It's a long flight. And it was about 11 o'clock at night. I was tapping away on my laptop. It's dark. Most people were watching the movie or sleeping. But I heard a conversation behind me on the airplane. Again, not to eavesdrop, but you'll see in a minute why it caught my attention. I could tell by their voices it was a man and a woman, and by their voices I could tell that they were elderly. I couldn't quite make out the husband's words. He was sort of mumbling. The wife's voice was penetrating. And as he mumbled, she answered, "Oh, don't say it would be better if you were dead." Whoa. They have my full attention at this point. I'm thinking, this is going to be a book. Right? That's not what I was thinking. What I'm thinking was, what's wrong with this poor man? He mumbles a little bit more, and she says, "It's not true nobody remembers you or cares about you anymore." It went on like this for 20 minutes. He was obviously disconsolate, and she was consoling him. And so I thought to myself, who is this guy? What's the portrait of the man on the plane? It's got to be somebody who's, let me tell you something, he's not one of you. He's not somebody who's done a lot with his life, and now he's probably disappointed near the end. Didn't get the education he wanted, didn't start the business he dreamed about, didn't exploit the opportunities that he should have, and now he's in his 80s, and, well, there's not that much time left. It made sense to me. About an hour later, we landed at Dulles Airport in Washington, and the lights went on, and everybody stood up, and now I'm curious. So I turned around just to get a look, and it was one of the most famous men in the world. You all would know who it is. Discretion prevents me from divulging his identity as well as potential lawsuits, but the point is not his actual identity. The point was that, look, I make my living as a social scientist, and I got it all wrong. I specialize in happiness. I was thinking to myself, I was laboring under the model that we all have of happiness, which is basically this. You want to be happy? Work hard, play by the rules, win, achieve, earn, bank it, die happy. Simple. And this guy was telling me that was all wrong. Was he an outlier? Or maybe is the model wrong? See, there isn't that much written about getting to satisfaction as you succeed. There isn't that much written about what the striver's life is supposed to be like, and hence how we're all supposed to act in a good and moral way. How are we supposed to live the satisfying life when we're trying as hard as we possibly can? I don't want to wind up at 85 telling my long-suffering wife, Esther, on an airplane that I might as well be dead. It's time to make some changes, I thought to myself. And I started a research project for my own life that is this book. I had no intention to publish it. I had intended to just do the work as a social scientist and live by what I found. My wife found my notes. She told me I should probably share it with my agent. The result is this book. I guess the moral of the story is, always listen to your wife. So here's the first research question that I have as I was doing this. What can I normally expect? Now, at the time I was 50 years old. That was 8 years ago. You can do the math. But I asked myself, normally what is the trajectory of happiness as we go through our lives? This is a graph here that I'm going to show you. And it's based on data I have on 416,000 citizens of this country. I also have data on Americans, and I have data on Indians and Chinese and Sub-Saharan Africans and South Americans, and it's all the same every place. Along the bottom is age, and up the top is self-perceived life satisfaction. You might ask yourself if that's accurate. Absolutely. It turns out that you can ask people how happy they are about their life in general, not right now, but in general how happy your life is compared to the happiest and unhappiest people you've ever met, and people will give you strikingly stable and honest answers if you ask them anonymously. You can't ask it in front of their spouse or they'll lie. Okay, so I'm going to show you what happens, and I'm not going to show you, it's on a 1 to 10 scale, where 1 is the most miserable person you ever met, and 10 is the happiest person you ever met. I'm only going to show you between 7 and 9 because that's where all the action is as the years go by. Now, first of all, think to yourself, what do you think this graph is going to look like? These are data that were collected by David Blanchflower. He's a British economist who teaches at Dartmouth University in New Hampshire. And he's the world's leading expert on this. He's collected the best data in the world on this. Now, I ask my students at Harvard University on the first day of class, they're all, on average, 27. Okay? And I say, imagine yourself in 10 years. Are you going to be happier or unhappier? They all say happier, right? They're optimists. They wouldn't be doing an MBA degree at Harvard University if they weren't optimists. They're going into debt. They better be optimists. That's all I can say. And I say, okay, why are you going to be happier at 37 than you are at 27? I say, well, things are going to be less tenuous. I'm going to have my family situation figured out. I'm going to have my work situation figured out. I'm going to be making a bunch of money. It's going to be great. I say, okay, plausible. How about 47? They say, probably even a little bit better for the same reasons. I say, okay, what about 77? They say, I don't want that. I'm like, why not? And they can't quite give me an answer. It just doesn't sound like fun to be old. Fine. I say, okay. So let's take a look at because what they're saying is, and I check this with them, I say, you're saying you're going to get happier and happier and happier, and at some point it's going to turn around, you're going to start to get less and less and less happy, right? And they're like, yeah, that's right. Okay. Let's look at the data on 500,000 people from the UK, which is the same thing as from every other country. Here we go. Sorry, I tell my students, because what this tells us is that the average person, and this is a very robust finding across the population, tends to get a little bit less and less and less and less happy from early 20s all the way to early 50s. Then good news, it turns around, starts coming back up, and then around age 70, it looks like it levels off all the way to, shall we say, the end. Okay, now, this requires a little bit of explanation, because now my students are really interested in what's going on with these, what's the explanation? This can't go unremarked, because this is the opposite of what they thought it was going to be. They thought it was going to be an upside down U, and it's a U like this, with a little shelf at the end. Well, to begin with, social scientists have a pretty good explanation for this downward part. This is not dramatic. This is just between about 9 and 7. This is not terrible news. It's just a slight diminution for the average person. Now, a little caveat, I'm a social scientist, your results may vary, right? But they probably won't, because most people it doesn't. To begin with, one of the biggest mistakes that my students make about their lives is thinking that these events, these circumstances, are going to bring them happiness. Now, think for a minute about it. If you said to yourself, how am I going to be happier when I'm 37 than 27? I'm going to make more money. You know that's wrong. You know in your heart that that's wrong, but you thought that when you were 27. And you did make more money for most of you, probably all of you, at 37 than at 27. And you got there, and it was kind of disappointing that you really weren't that much happier. And that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. That disappointment itself brings people down. That's according to an economist named Hannes Schwant, who teaches at the University of Vienna. The second reason has to do with some physiological characteristics we don't quite understand yet. There's a lot of new and cutting-edge research on chimpanzees and macaques, which are close to us. Chimpanzees share between 96 and 98% of our genetic material as human beings. And you find that they have a midlife crisis, just like we do. They don't know they're middle-aged. They don't know how old they are. They just know they feel crummy. As they get older, they get this dip just like humans. We don't quite know why that is. Interestingly, one of the easiest things to teach a middle-aged male chimpanzee is how to smoke. It's like, give me something. It basically is what they seem to be. It's anything. So there's something about that we don't quite understand yet. The third is what we'll euphemistically refer to as family difficulties. Now, to begin with, a lot of when you're looking at this dip in here, there tends to be kind of a malaise in marriages between the 20th and 30th year. This is not divorce territory necessarily. For most people, it isn't divorce territory, but it's a little bit less exciting, and if you can get through it, it tends to get much better. But that 20 to 30 year mark is a little bit tricky for most people. You see marital satisfaction declines. This is also the hardest time with kids because that's when they're teenagers. And teenage kids, let's say, lots and lots of meaning and purpose, not that much enjoyment. I have 3 adult children. And when I was writing this and I was doing this work initially, they were all teenagers. And it was not great, shall we say. My middle son, Carlos, he was a real challenge. He was still in high school in those days. And it was just one thing. I remember, it was like I was right in here and I was charting up these data going, it's like, that's Carlos right here, right? And I get it, And, my wife and I were just like, it's like there was a frequent flyer program into the headmaster's office at the school, again and again. And it was the same thing. It's like, Carlos is failing math. It was the same thing. Thank you. And it was always a grades problem. His grades we're just not. And finally, my wife is from Barcelona. She's an optimist. She says, look at it this way. At least we know he's not cheating. It was just, anyway. But the good news is they move out. That's not it. That's not it. The really good news is, by the way, he's a U.S. Marine Special Forces. I mean, thank God for the U.S. Marine Corps. That's all I can do. Because his violent kinetic energy is turned on America's enemies now. So getting good laughs at his expense. Anyway, so it's like, that's my revenge, quite frankly. It turns around. It turns around. And a lot of this has to do with the attitude that we have, the expectations that we have for ourselves, the fact that we care less about social comparison, that we're more sure about who we are as people, that we're better able to manage our emotions. There's a lot of stories that go into this upward trajectory. And by the way, almost everybody gets that except for two groups, people who are substance abuse users, substance addicted, and people with untreated mood disorders, which is to say anxiety and clinical depression. But apart from those two groups, almost everybody gets happier. Now here's the weird part. Here's the real mystery up to this point. It looks like you just kind of hover there for the rest of your life. That turns out to be a complete illusion. Why? Because I'm averaging across the population here, and this is actually an average across two equal groups that I'm going to show you now. What I'm getting at is, this is my research to figure out the guy on the plane. And I'm going to show you now what happened with the guy on the plane using what's really going on behind the data. So let me smooth out the data a little bit. And you're going to see here are the first two parts. You bottom out at about 53. Things start to get better. 66, 68, even 70 is now the point where it looks like you're going to start to get stable all the rest of your life in terms of your happiness. No. Now you break up into one of two equal-sized groups that do that. Which branch do you want to be on? I'm just going to take a guess. I know what branch the guy in the plane was on. He was on the lower branch, and that's a paradox. Because the world says, if I showed you this without giving you any preparation, you would have said, I know who's going to get on the upper branch. The people who succeed. Successful people get on the upper branch. So, one of two possibilities. The guy in the plane was an outlier, or our model is busted and we need to understand this better. Which is it? Let's go to the work on successful people and strivers. Now I'm talking about worldly success. There are lots and lots of people who don't have worldly success who are wildly successful as happy people, as good parents, as morally upright. I'm talking about worldly strivers. I'm talking about you. Okay? So, what do we know from the social psychological literature about how people who have a lot of early success, how they turn out in terms of their happiness? And this work comes from Carol and Charles Holohan, two social psychologists at the University of Texas at Austin. They do work on people who are identified as super strivers when they're young. Okay, so maybe, thank you, Philippa, that maybe some of you were identified by your parents as really, really hard workers, as good students. You got a lot of high marks in school, and you were identified as a real striver early on. I bet most of you were identified in this particular way. Okay, now, that seems like it's great for giving you lots and lots of success. Maybe some of your parents, maybe some of you with your kids said, you're special to your kids, right? This is one of the things that people love to tell their kids, and probably gave you a lot of pleasure when you were a child, that you're special, you're the special one. I remember hearing this a lot from my mother. My mother was a professional painter. My father was a mathematician. And my mother, she really endowed in me a lot of her kind of ambitions for me to be a professional classical musician. That's all she really wanted for me. And I was very talented as a French horn player from an early age. And indeed, I spent my entire 20s as a professional classical French horn player, most of it in the Barcelona Symphony, as a matter of fact. It gave her a great deal of pride. She said, see, I always told you that you were the special one, she said to me. Is that a good thing to do? No, that's a bad thing to do. Why? Because according to Carol, God bless my mom, she was doing the best she could. And she really felt it. But Carol and Charles Holohan have data on people who are identified as the special one as children, who are identified as especially hard workers, as especially intelligent, as having a lot of promise, and told that they're the most likely to be disappointed about their lives at the age of 80. The more that you're objectified as the special one by your parents and by yourself, the more likely you are not to be able to live up to your own impossibly high standards. Parenting advice: don't tell them they're geniuses. Let them live their lives. That's the bottom line. Because you will set them up for disappointment if you do it any other way. That's what these data clearly say. It's impossible to live up to your own expectations. And you build people into these self-objectifying success machines. And it becomes enormously difficult for them. Now, it turns out you see this all over the place. We have all of these stories about the greatest men and women who've ever lived, the greatest strivers, and all their wonderful successes. Nobody ever asked, did they die happy? Nobody ever asks that particular question because we don't care, because we objectify them too. Let me tell you the real story that you thought you already knew, but didn't, of Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, if you make a list of the 3 greatest natural scientists of the past 500 years, he's on your list. He has to be on your list. The author of the theory of natural selection of evolution, it changed the way that we see biology in the natural world forever. Why doesn't he look so happy? He's about 52 in that picture. The answer is he was a big mess. Let me tell you a little bit about the story that you might or might not know. Now, you know that he was buried a hero at age 73 at Westminster Abbey, venerated his grave. Scientists literally go and venerate his grave still today. He died a bitter, broken, disappointed man. Now, it didn't start that way. He was actually a pretty mediocre student here. He was designated by his parents to be a member of the clergy, which he did not want to do, and so he didn't really study very hard. He actually kind of skipped out of class and didn't pay attention enough to his mathematics, didn't learn much in statistics, never learned his German. But he got a big break, because what he really dreamed about was not being a clergyman. He wanted to be a scientist. He read science books for fun in his spare time, and he was selected mostly through nepotism. But nonetheless, he was selected to be the naturalist on a sailing ship around the world when he was 22 years old on a ship called the Beagle. Most of you know this. He was the resident naturalist to collect plant and animal samples and send them back to London, where they would be studied by botanists, zoologists, and scientists and sent all over Europe. He did this for 5 years, never went home once. For 5 years, he traveled the world, very famously in places like the Galapagos Islands. And what he was finding was evidence of living species in different places around the world that seemed to be connecting the fossil record in Europe with animals that were currently alive. It seemed to be linking things. How did this happen? Well, he didn't have an explanation for it until he came back at age 27 and dropped an intellectual atomic bomb on science, which was the theory of evolution. Boom! It changed everything almost overnight. Now, it was great if you're Darwin, because he was at age 27, the most celebrated scientist in all of Europe in his mid-20s. And he loved it. He dined out on that. He got rich. He got famous. Big parties. And he developed this over the next 25 years, developing his theories, getting more famous. He loved it. Who wouldn't? But then a problem happened. See, in his early 50s, suddenly, his progress stopped. Big mystery. Not really. It turned out that the science had progressed to the point where he needed more math than he had. Remember, he didn't study his math hard. Kids, study your math. At 52, his own field surpassed his ability. He needed something that subsequently became known as genetics that had been developed by a Czech monk named Gregor Mendel, which was highly mathematical, highly statistical, and written in German, all of which was mysterious to Darwin, and Darwin could never make any more progress in his own field. He wrote 11 more books, but they were derivative. They were disappointing. They were like straw. And the last 2 decades of his life, he considered himself to be a disappointment and indeed a failure. Nobody talks about that lower branch on the happiness curve for Charles Darwin, who could not live up to his own expectations, who could not enjoy his past successes. All he could experience was his current lack of ability to continue to develop in his own field. That was what dominated his perception. He died a broken man. So here's the question. What should Darwin have done differently besides having studied his math? What should Darwin be paying attention to? What should you be paying attention to, and me, such that we don't have to continuously have these successes that might or might not elude us? What is the secret to having a more and more satisfying life? Is there any way, or are you doomed as a striver to be disappointed at 75? Is this just your fate? Doesn't look good so far. This is where I am in the research. And by the way, I wasn't very happy at this point in my research because I found that the man on the plane was not an outlier. I found that the man on the plane was going to be me. It turned out that I was missing a few details. And that's what I'm going to tell you about now. It turns out that you can hack this matrix and get around this problem to become one of the people in history who was a true striver and who wound up even happier. But you can't leave it up to chance. You need to do a series of things of which I'm going to tell you 3 right now. Number 1, you need to get on your second curve. Obviously, I'm going to tell you what these things mean. Second, you need to chip away the jade of your life. And third, you need to tend to your roots. Let's start with the first. Now, this is a curve that was developed from data by a professor at Northwestern University in the suburbs of Chicago, a guy named Benjamin Jones. And he looks at the average age, the probability of having Nobel Prize-winning science work and at what age it was performed, as well as the likelihood of having an extremely inflecting, impactful scientific patent. When do great scientists do their best work, is the question. The answer is 39. 39. Okay, now, it's not always 39. There are other people older and younger, but not that many. It turns out that 39 is kind of a magic age for science. The likelihood of doing Nobel Prize quality work is the same at 20 as it is at 70, which is 0. Now, we don't want to think about that because we want to think that anybody can do anything at any particular age, and Benjamin Jones says, no, no, no. Now, this explains a lot of the disappointment in the man on the plane's life and in Darwin's life. See, Darwin absolutely followed this graph. So did the man on the plane, by the way, who had great heroic achievements in his 20s and 30s. That's when he did his work. And that's what he was looking back on 50 years later with great disappointment. They follow this particular graph. Now, why is this a problem? Because when you do great things, you're going to notice them when they're over. Look, if you don't do anything with your life, you won't notice it when it's over. I didn't do anything. I didn't know it was finished. You do a lot, you're going to feel it, is the bottom line. What goes up must come down. The higher you go up, the higher the lower that you actually fall. And that becomes more painful and bitter. This pattern was recognized over the course of the 20th century in social psychology, most notably by a social psychologist right here in London named Raymond Cattell. This is Raymond Cattell, lived between 1905 and 1998. And he noticed that there's kind of 2 sorts of genius that manifest themselves. The really spectacular geniuses like Charles Darwin, or the man on the plane, or any of your most favorite scientists. They all have this curve where they have early preternatural success, where they're getting more and more impactful through their 20s and more famous through their 20s and 30s. And the more they work, the better they get. That's the 10,000 hours. He called that geniuses with fluid intelligence. He was an intelligence researcher. He looked at the way that we develop cognitively. And he defined this fluid intelligence as basically we call it your Mark Zuckerberg intelligence curve. Comes on early, burns hot, gets better. What is it characteristic of? Incredible complex problem solving, working memory, creativity, innovation, indefatigable energy. You What made you good at what you do, whether you're a lawyer or a doctor, a financial professional, you work at a think tank, whatever you happen to do. By the way, maybe you're a plumber, maybe you're an electrician. It's all the same. With fluid intelligence, you just get better and better and better at it, and it's intensely satisfying. The harder you work, the better the payoff because you get more and more skill and mastery over what you do. This gives you the ability to crack the problems that other people give you that other people can't see. I talk to young lawyers a lot, young litigators right out of law school. They can do things that the older lawyers can never dream of. It's just amazing. Or surgeons, or in any skilled field, from accounting, once again, to the trades. Things that require skill can be perfected with fluid intelligence. Here's the problem. It goes up and it comes down. According to Raymond Cattell, and subsequent research has verified this in abundant detail, the structure of the prefrontal cortex of the brain lends itself to more and more acute fluid intelligence through your 20s and 30s, peaking at about age 39. And in the early 40s, it starts to decline. What was easy becomes hard. What used to be hard becomes impossible. Now, I know, for most real high achievers, for most strivers, nobody's going to notice. You're not going to notice that the lawyer is not as crisp in the decision-making as she once was. No, but she notices. And that's the big problem that people have. The really high achievers, they're the ones who notice they're not quite on their game. Think about it this way. That dentist who's really good, somebody recommended, always does it right, weirdly at age 45 starts taking Fridays off. How come? That's because being a dentist isn't as fun as it used to be. The nature of human endeavor is that when you're getting better, it's fun, and when you're not, it's not. Especially highly trained professionals, it's only fun when you're making progress. Regress is terrible. And they'll notice. It's just like, that's what burnout feels like. That's the reason that professionals about age 45 start talking about, I just like it less than I used to. That's because they're fading in fluid intelligence. Nobody tells them that, but they just kind of know. Okay. So this was what Raymond Cattell noticed, but he noticed something else, which is a second type of genius that tends to develop at older ages. These are people who are geniuses in kind of a different way. He called this the crystallized intelligence type of genius, which we'll call as our friend at the Legatum Institute here, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. This is somebody who's pure crystallized intelligence, which is really wisdom. This is a kind of intelligence that comes on much later. It's a different set of skills, accumulated knowledge, experience, wisdom, judgment, teaching, mentoring, team building. Crystallized intelligence is a different kettle of fish. More satisfying for people who actually have it, but very different than fluid intelligence. Now, what do we know about it? It increases through your 40s and 50s. There's a reason that the greatest teachers are not 25 years old. At my university, universally, the best teaching evaluations go to professors over 70. This is not charity. There is no charity at Harvard University, I can assure you. This is because people over 70 can explain complex concepts and synthesize knowledge, put together stories much better than people can when they're in their 20s and 30s. It's an extraordinary thing that comes on and you see it in your own life perhaps. I noticed, for example, I'm much better at foreign languages today than when I was in my 30s. It's strange. My accent isn't better, but my vocabulary and grammar are. I can give speeches in Spanish that I would not have dared given when I was 29 or 30 years old, even when I was living in Spain. I noticed that I go look back at my mathematical papers written when I was in my mid-30s. I was doing highly mathematical, early artificial intelligence research in my mid-30s. I can't read those papers anymore. I wrote them. Today, I can write for audiences in a way that I would not have been able to before. Why? Because I had fluid intelligence then. I have crystallized intelligence now. Now, what would happen if all of my ego, all of my identity were tied to my fluid intelligence curve? I'd go all the way up to the top and love it, and then I'd ride it all the way down to the cellar and miss it for the rest of my life. Sound familiar? That sounds awfully familiar when I read the story of Charles Darwin or many others like Linus Pauling, the great two-time Nobel winner who spent the later years of his life trying to get back his past glory. Or so many other people that you probably know, maybe even some people that you love. Here's what it looks like graphically. fluid versus crystallized intelligence. Here are the two curves together. You find that the fluid intelligence curve increases through childhood and young adulthood, peaks and falls, and is crossed in somewhere in the mid-40s. The people who really crack the code, who really do it right, they step from one to the other. But you got to retool your life. You got to go from your innovator curve to your teacher curve, innovator to instructor, from the star litigator to the managing partner, from the entrepreneur to the venture capitalist, from the hot researcher to the master teacher. There is something in your world that's in each one of these curves. Ask yourself this: which one do you want? I like to look at the work of a social psychologist named Dean Keith Simonton, University of California. And he does work on the creative careers. He does work, for example, on poets versus historians. This is the half-life of their careers, means when is half of their work done? At what age have they done half of their work? And which half is the better half? This is the question he likes to ask, looking across vast numbers of really prominent careers. Poetry is a pure fluid intelligence profession insofar that you're inventing things with words. On average, poets have done half of their work at age 40, and the better half is the first half. T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, they lived into their 80s. Their best poems were in their late 20s and early 30s. What about historians? Pure crystallized intelligence. You have to have a huge library that you're drawing on. You don't have to remember it quickly because you can't. You know how this is. By the way, there's a new area of research that I'm finding really fascinating. People think that their memory reduction after age 40 has something to do with degradation of the prefrontal cortex. It's not true. It has everything to do with the size of your library and your filing system. You know so much stuff that you need a vast library, stacks and stacks of books. And it takes longer for you to recall things because there's just so much in there. I talk to my kids, they can come up with a name just like that. Because they have like 3 books in their library. Right? Me, a guy comes up and I can't remember his name, so I send my librarian, my little creaky librarian, back to the stacks to get his name. And he stops in periodicals and talks to a guy and has a cup of coffee. 10 minutes later, he comes back and says, "Oh, that guy's name was Mike. And Mike is long gone and I look like an idiot. What's going on? I got a big library." Is the whole bottom line. And you got to know how to use it and use it right, because that's the essence of crystallized intelligence, is an enormous library, as opposed to quick recall across 9 books. This is the great historian David McCullough, 88 years old. Until 86, when he had his stroke, he was writing his best work. You find that historians do half of their work after age 65, and it's the better half. If you're a historian, take care of your health, because your best books are coming in the subsequent decades. Okay, so this is the first skill. Get on your second curve. This is what the happiest older strivers have in common, is that they know there's a second curve, they get on the second curve, or if they're lucky, they just do it by accident. You now don't have to do it by accident, because you now have the knowledge. What are you doing to share your wisdom? What is your second curve, and how are you getting on it? That's lesson 1. Now, why would you stay stuck on that first curve, even if you know that? The answer is, people like doing what they do well, and they don't like learning new stuff. The bottom line, basically. I was contemplating this on a trip to Taiwan. You'll see in a minute how I'm thinking about the metaphor here. I used to go to Taiwan a lot on business for state visits to see the president of Taiwan. When I was working at the American Enterprise Institute, we had a close relationship with the free Taiwanese and valiant and courageous Taiwanese. And I was taking a tour of the National Palace Museum, which is the world's greatest exhibition of Chinese art and artifacts, going back 8,000 years into the present. I mean, it's an amazing collection. Many of you have seen it. It's so vast that you can't see you've seen this when you go to a museum and you try to see too much. You're just walking past prints and pots, and all you remember is the snack bar at the end, right? So I didn't want to do that. I want to avoid that. So I hired a guy. Got to get a guy. And the guy was a philosopher and art historian who was an expert in both Eastern and Western art. Okay? And I said, I just want to understand 5 things. Just 5 pieces. Give me 5 pieces. And I want you to really explain the history and the deep philosophy behind it. I said, fine. Okay. So we're going through, and he's showing me these intricate jade carvings and pottery and things, just basic early Neolithic things all the way up to the Qing dynasty. It's incredible stuff he's showing me. And I asked him this question. I said, when I'm looking at a piece of, typical Chinese carving, say out of green jade, I can look at it. I don't really have to know anything about art at all, and I know it's Chinese. How do I know that? How do I just know that? He said, it has to do with the philosophy of the art. Okay. I said, so tell me more. And he, of course, answered my question elliptically with a question, very Chinese. He said, when you think of a work of art yet to be started as a Westerner, what do you think? I said, an empty canvas. He said, correct. Because you think of art as starting de novo, from nothing. And the art comes into existence as you put brush strokes on the canvas. It starts with nothing and it comes into existence, almost immaculately conceived. That's your concept of art in the West. I said, yeah. He said, that's not how we see things. See, there's a problem with that. And I said, what is it? He said, you can only go so far. After a while, you can't do any more because that becomes that. Right? By the way, that's a Jackson Pollock painting worth $30 million. So that's pretty good. But my point is, if I did that, it would be worth nothing. Now he said, that is also how you Westerners think of your life. You think of your life as an empty canvas for you to fill up with stuff and possessions and things and glories and prestige, experiences, the bucket list of your life. That's what you think of. The problem is by about age 40, it looks like this. And then you've got no place to go, right? Because you add more stuff, and what are you going to add to that? It's not going to be better when you add more things to that. And this is what explains, it seemed to me, the frustrations that I have from people who are now my age. I'm not feeling it. I guess I'll get a boat. That's just another brush stroke. Perfectly. I guess I'll try some new thing. I'll have some new experiences. I'll cross off, go on a hot air balloon ride. That should give me some satisfaction. No, it won't. He said, we think of art in the West as starting from this. This is our metaphor. And by the way, he talked about it in terms of music and all sorts of more complex metaphors as well. He said, this is art yet to be started. The art already exists. It's already in that. That block of jade contains the finished sculpture. My job is simple, not to add things until it becomes the art, but to chip away the jade until the thing that was already in there is exposed. Now that's a non-trivial difference, isn't it? He said this is also how we see a complete and perfect life. To take away all the things that aren't you until you find you, and then you will be complete. I thought to myself, aha. So this is me at 40. This should be me at 80. Why? Because I start with the Western metaphor. I got it. There's nothing wrong with that. Add the paint, add the paint, add. But you better change metaphors. See that first curve? That's the canvas. That's adding. That's climbing that curve. The second curve? That's the block of jade. This is how we need to see our lives. Now, there's lots of ways to see this metaphor under different circumstances. And there's a lot of it that actually goes into Western social psychology as well. Here's my favorite. We have a tendency to build a model for satisfaction that basically says, you want to be satisfied? Get all the stuff you want. And the limbic system of your brain indicates that that's the right formula. The limbic system of your brain is a bundle of tissue that was evolved over a 40 million year period. And it stopped evolving 1 million years ago. You need it to react to all of your urges and your aspirations, all the natural stuff, all of your basic emotions in your brain. And your limbic system says, you want to be happy and satisfied? Get the stuff you want. Get more. That's your basic model. Satisfaction is a function of what you have. And it's wrong. Now, one thing I'm going to make an assertion here. Mother Nature, which built that system, doesn't care if you're happy. Mother Nature wants you to pass on your genes. That's all Mother Nature really cares about. Happiness, that's your responsibility. And to get happy, you need a different model. That's more like the Eastern model. That Eastern model in our more mathematical terms might be satisfaction. And by the way, this is a model that has been subjected to empirical scrutiny. This is not shooting from the hip. Satisfaction is not a question of what you have. It's what you have divided by what you want. Now think about your high school fractions for a minute. You know that if you want a number to go up and it's a fraction, you can increase the numerator or you can decrease the denominator. The problem that we have, if we don't know that the real model of satisfaction is what you have divided by what you want, is that you can have, and the wants will explode and you won't even know it. Your denominator will be going up. I have a very close friend, who's a mutual friend of some of you here. Who's a titan of the private equity industry from way back. He said to himself, I'm gonna know how I'm successful by being able to go to the Mercedes dealership and buy a car in cash, right? I mean, who buys a car at Mercedes in cash? I mean, drug dealers and private equity managers, apparently. So, and so he said he got there when he was 32. He's a very successful guy. He goes in with a check, actually, says, I want my car. They give him the keys. He walks out. As he's driving off the lot, he's thinking to himself, I should have saved for 6 more months and gotten the Ferrari. What happened? His haves went up and his wants exploded like the suburbs of London. He actually became less satisfied because he didn't have a wants management strategy. What my guide in Taiwan was basically telling me is that you want to be satisfied, you want to have a beautiful sense of your own completion, you don't need a haves management strategy, you don't need to have more, you need to want less. How can you do that? 2 days ago was my birthday. And every year on my birthday now, I have an exercise I go through. See, when I was 40, I used to do my bucket list. For those of you who are not Americans, which is, I guess, all of you except for Mark, that, Americans have this bucket list idea, which you've probably heard of. And sorry, Ellen. And it's, yeah, sorry. And the bucket list is the dumbest thing ever. The bucket list is you take out of the bucket all of your wants and all of your sticky cravings and appetites and desires, right? And they make you feel like a real loser because the list of the stuff that you haven't done, but it's supposed to fire you up with ambition so that you will do those things. It's the worst way to be happy. That's this. And I used to do that when I was 40 years old. Now, and 2 days ago I do a reverse bucket list, where I make a list of my sticky cravings, I list them, and then I put together a strategy for detaching myself from each thing on that list. From non-attachment to each one of those things. It's amazing, isn't it? And a few years ago, I remember I thought, what I'm gonna do this year? I'm gonna get rid of 2/3 of my clothes. Sure enough, on my birthday, packed it all off. Gave it to charity, right? It was super easy, no big deal. So you know what I did last year? I gave away half of my political opinions. The great Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh, who's the master of the Plum Village communities. I wrote his obituary in the Washington Post, as a matter of fact. His thinking has affected me and many of you. Thich Nhat Hanh said that there's so many cravings and attachments in life, but that which subjugates most of us the most is to our opinions. And it's true in our society today, where it's like, fine, so you stole my car, but don't cross me in my politics or I'll have to kill you. That's how we work in a populist, polarized society, isn't it? That we're so attached to our views. So I gave away half of my political opinions, and I feel like I'm free. I can have more friends. I can be less annoyed. I can't believe how good it feels, because I had a wants management strategy as opposed to a haves management strategy. Here's the Yungang grottos in Western China, which was completed in the year 453 BC. It was built over a 40-year period by 10,000 stone cutting artisans. It's 7 stories tall. It's just amazing. Think about it this way. The first half of your life is building up that mountain, little by little, pebble by pebble, a handful of dirt by handful of dirt to build the mountain. And the second half of your life is carving off the side of that mountain until you can see the Buddha. When you're 58 years old, don't be making the mountain bigger. There's no reason for you to make the mountain bigger. Now, I'm not talking about money, my friends. I'm talking about the cravings, the things, the attachments. You need to carve things away that you find you. Chip away the jade to find yourself, and in yourself, you will see your second curve. What do you need to subtract this year? It's a question for all of us. when I was working on this, doing this research, I was spending some time in Aspen, Colorado. Some of you have been to Aspen, Colorado, beautiful Aspen, Colorado. I mean, I speak every year at the Aspen Ideas Festival, which is this big festival where people give speeches and talk about ideas. And it's a beautiful place. And it's called Aspen, named after the Aspen Tree, which is this. And many of you know this is a really beautiful, stately tree with yellow leaves and characteristic of that part of the Rocky Mountains and many other places in the United States, indeed around the world. And I was thinking, as I was looking at this beautiful aspen tree, it reminded me of the first Psalm, which is so near to the hearts of so many of us as Jews and Christians. And indeed, the Psalms, you can get pretty much all the happiness advice you need just by reading the elegies of King David. The name of my book, From Strength to Strength, comes from the 84th Psalm. In Hebrew, Michael el Chayel, which is an ancient Judaic blessing, may you go from strength to strength. This, from the first Psalm, I was recalling, you see this, the idea that King David says that he's talking about the righteous man. The righteous man. He's like a tree planted by streams of water, yielding its fruit in season, whose leaf does not wither, and who prospers in all that he does. Successful people, strivers, tend to think of themselves in this kind of solitary, strong way. This is me. Look, I got problems, but you can count on me. I'm going to be here today and tomorrow and next week. You can take your shade under me, right? Maybe I'm alone, but I'm tough. That's how strivers kind of see themselves. And I remember thinking that that's a nice metaphor for me and a friend of mine in Aspen, who knows more about botany than I do, which is practically everybody. He said, actually, this metaphor is all wrong. And I said, why? He said, because an aspen tree isn't a single plant. Every aspen tree in a grove is the same plant. It's actually one root system. This is a characteristic of the aspen tree, that every single tree is one shoot out of the same organism. He said, do you realize that the world's largest living organism in the history of Earth is still alive right now? It's in Utah. It's called Pando, and that's it. It is a stand of aspen trees. That's 106 acres, 6 million kilograms of wood. That's the world's largest living organism, and it's one plant. You get the point that I'm making here, right? You think that you're the solitary aspen tree. You're not. That is an illusion. Now, our Buddhist brothers and sisters, the Dalai Lama likes to explain to all of us, which I've had the incredible privilege of working closely with the Dalai Lama for the past 10 years, and he always says to me the same thing. When he's leaving, he always says, don't forget, you are 1 in 7 billion. By this, he does not mean that I'm an ant, or I'm a speck, or insignificant. He's telling me that I am part of one living, breathing body of humanity, and we're all sisters and brothers with no exceptions. If you look around at the pictures on the wall of the Legatum Institute, if you want to know why I'm involved in the Legatum Institute, is because we are just a few shoots off the same root system. That is the ethos that has created this institution. And it's manifestly true. You want to be a striver who gets happier? That tree that you look at when you're looking in the mirror, to mix my metaphors just a little bit, it's not a single plant. Look to the tree next to you, your friends, your workmates, your children. That's you. The question is not to cultivate the beauty of each leaf on your tree. The question is for you to cultivate the root system, because indeed, your true self isn't the sum of your achievements. It's the sum of the love for the people in your life. Are you counting correctly or not? Now, I started with a little story of Charles Darwin. It would be a good idea if I gave you an example of somebody who did it right. Because otherwise, you might wonder if it's possible. Let me tell you about somebody who did it right. Who's this man? This is Johann Sebastian Bach. Now, I told you early on that I was a classical musician for a long time. Bach was my favorite composer. Now, Bach is not very distinguishing. Most people love Bach. You all, whether you know nothing about music or not, you've heard of Bach. Bach lived between 1685 and 1750. So productive that he published more than 1,000 pieces of music across all instrumentations of his time, and at the same time had 20 children. That's productive. Bach was, early on in his life, was the picture of fluid intelligence, unbelievable innovative capacity, and a style of music called the High Baroque. He was par excellence the innovator of his time. Princes sought him out for commissions. Nobody could dominate the craft like he could and innovate at the same time. It was just amazing through his 20s and 30s. But then when he was 50, something happened. His own son, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, created a new style of music called the classical style that ripped through Europe and rendered the high Baroque almost overnight as obsolete as disco is to us today. And Bach the father was left behind. He couldn't keep up. He simply couldn't write in the new style. And he didn't want to, and he didn't like it. Newfangled classical stuff. So what did he do? He could have been like Darwin, going to his grave feeling like a loser, shaking his fist at the heavens. No. He changed his career completely and became the most celebrated teacher of his day. He took a position at the Thomaskirche in Leipzig, where he was the cantor and the organ teacher and the choir teacher, and he dedicated himself to writing textbooks, text material. When he died, he was writing something called Die Kunst der Fuge, the art of fugue, which was the laying down for posterity, not for amusement or entertainment. He was writing down for posterity all of the greatest styles of the high Baroque, thinking maybe at some point somebody will find this useful. It turns out 100 years after his death, the composer Felix Mendelssohn found the score, dusted it off, and said, gather around. This is the most amazing thing I've ever heard. And since then, that work has been played in concert. Imagine writing a textbook so beautiful that it's read as literature. That's Bach's work in the art of fugue. Unbeknownst to him completely, he dedicated himself to the love of others, to serving other people with his crystallized intelligence. And he died surrounded by his many children and his many, many grandchildren and his students who revered him, not as an innovator, but as an instructor. He was the picture of fluid intelligence to crystallized intelligence and dying a happy man. Let me show you now, because I'm going to give you a little flavor for what Bach was working on when he literally died. This is the piece he was writing that abruptly stops mid-measure, that was finished by his own son, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, his usurper, who wrote in the margins, at this point, the composer, his father, put down his pen and died. Strong finish. This is Contrapunctus number 3, the last work, the crystallized intelligence masterpiece of Johann Sebastian Bach. The months before he wrote that, he was asked by a minor biographer, now lost to posterity, why do you write music? His answer was this, textually this, except I'm going to give it to you in English. He said, the aim and final of all music is nothing less than the glorification of God and the refreshment of the soul. That's crystallized intelligence. Here's my bottom line. Be Bach, not Darwin. Thank you.